Good afternoon and welcome to Miami Alumni and Friends. I'm Molly Young from the Miami University Alumni Association. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for a special presentation, Fading Glory, Ethics and Politics of International and Sport Mega Events. I'm joined today by Adam Beissel, Assistant Professor of Sport Leadership and Management in the College of Engineering, Education, Health, and Society. This presentation is part of Winter College, bringing Miami to you online. We hope you'll consider joining us each day this week at noon and tune in again on Friday evening to celebrate Charter Day with 11 honor awards at 6 and a bourbon tasting with alum Phil Collin and special guest Dr. Mike Crowder at 7. You can register for events tomorrow starting at noon, and you can register for all of those at alumlc.org/MiamiOH. Those of you watching live today will also have the opportunity to ask live questions during Adam's presentation. You can just click Ask a Question below your video on the webinar site, and we'll attempt to answer those during the Q&A portion. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Adam, to get us started. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for hosting me. I'm excited to deliver this presentation to all of you. As Molly mentioned, my name is Adam Beissel. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Sport Leadership and Management. And looking over all the presentations during Winter College, I'm afraid my presentation doesn't involve wine tasting or beer making, but we'll be talking about something that I think most people like and enjoy, and maybe not as much as alcohol, but that's sport. And ironically, those two often go hand in hand, sport and alcohol. So specifically what I'm going to talk about today is to take you really inside the classroom and what it might look like for you to have a typical class in our sport leadership and management program. So I've modified the delivery of what I'm about to present a little bit to be more conducive to an online medium. So in the actual classroom, it would be much more interactive. There'd be loads of questions, discussion prompts, breakout sessions for students. But what we're going to do today is I'll present my information and then we'll do all that at the end. So we'll interrogate this concept known as soft power, which some of you may have come across before. But this concept of soft power is important when understanding all the various elements that go into an international sport mega event like the Olympic Games or the FIFA World Cup. Then we'll shift our focus and drill down specifically into an event that undoubtedly some of you would have watched, and that was the 2022 Men's World Cup in Qatar, to explore these soft power strategies, as well as the emergence of this concept of sports washing, which some of you may have come across. And then when we get to the end, that's when we'll have some discussion prompts and a little bit of a Q&A to engage all of you and to get some of your thoughts on what I've presented to you. So that doesn't mean you have to hold all of your questions to the end. Molly will be moderating and collecting those in the chat. She can pass them along to me as we get to the end. So I'll do my best to address them and keep you engaged as we go along before we get to that Q&A and that discussion at the end. So international relations and soft power, attraction and persuasion. Before we get into that concept of soft power, I want to just take a brief moment to give a bit of an overview of how we're going to understand international relations and the relationship to sport. Very basically, international relations is simply the relationship between independent nation states, the people, and the governments that rule them. So international relations, they tend to reflect the nature of a global civil society, the way that nations interrelate, interact with one another, or are related to one another. And those relationships tend to reflect the politics, the economics, the cultures, the societies of the countries that are engaged in that series of global politics. Now, we can start with this image of Anthony Bilkin, the Secretary of State, who's probably the lead international diplomat representing the U.S. government abroad at the moment. And this is sort of what he does. He manages international relations by representing America and American national interests in relation to other diplomats. So here he is shaking hands with the diplomat from China. And those relationships, those events, those diplomatic missions often are a way to foster those international relations. So that's sort of how international relations works in a broad sense. It's that traditional diplomacy, epitomized here by the shaking of hands of representatives of national states. And as Joseph Nye, a scholar here, acknowledges, what he says is that within this context, we have traditional diplomacy, and that's just simply the ways that nations express their influence in international relations. But well, we've got our new ways of doing that. Long has this series of diplomacy evolved away from the kind of traditional, very formal handshaking toward a notion of what Nye calls public diplomacy. And what he says is that nations use culture, they use ideology and institutions that he says are intangible sources of power that help shape the way nations are understood and nations relate to one another, and arguably how a particular nation is viewed among the international community. So Nye calls this public diplomacy, which is related to traditional diplomacy, but slightly different. In fact, the US actually has its own Department of Public Diplomacy, the communication with foreign publics to essentially positively influence their views and values related to a nation. So it's that communication with foreign publics. And here we have Elizabeth Allen, who is the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. And you can read the mission of what the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy is tasked with, but it's much more about using a nation's people, its cultures, its ideas to shape the nation, an image of a nation within the global public. So this notion of public diplomacy, it's actually been around for quite a long period of time. The role and function of this is, as I've said, to positively influence the way a nation is perceived by people around the world. So we can even go back to the 1960s, and here we have an example of JFK going to West Berlin at the height of the Cold War as a means of public diplomacy in order to really advance the image and influence of the United States to the rest of the world at the height of the Cold War. So it's not just about meeting Berliners, it was more about demonstrating the significance, the culture, the economic might, if you will, of the United States to the rest of the world. So this is a very classic example of a way in which public diplomacy was used by an American leader. Now, soft power is something that Joseph Nye came out with in his 2004 book entitled Soft Power, the Means of Success in World Politics. And what I think Nye is referring to when he uses this term soft power, I think what he's referring to is the ways in which public diplomacy in many different examples can be used to position a nation within the global community. Now, it's important to acknowledge the ways in which soft power, as Nye is describing it, relates differently and similarly to notions of hard power. And so I'm going to explain that difference here momentarily. So what Nye says is that there are actually two forms of power, two ways in which nations try and present themselves to the world. The aim of hard power is really domination. It's command, it's coercion, and it's often epitomized by the use of military force, sometimes economic sanctions. And this is the classic way throughout much of human history that nations would try and exert influence and power within the global sphere. So hard power is about soft power, on the other hand, is really about trying to attract and persuade people to a particular viewpoint. It's very different than the hard power approaches that, as I've said, predominated much of human history. So some examples then, hard power, or as a definition, is really that influence of the behavior of others to get the outcomes that one wants. And here we're talking about usually through military force, through police force, through economic sanctions. Hard power, according to Nye, is coercive. It's influencing the behavior in the global community to get others to do or achieve to get the outcomes that you want. So you're really forcing people, oftentimes by the butt of the gun, into various means to get others around the world into doing what you want. And so we have plenty of examples of this throughout human history, but the one that we would think about right now would be Russia's invasion within Crimea and the Crimean Peninsula, and in some ways, the US and the West's response to that through a series of economic sanctions. So that's really what we're talking about with this kind of hard power, traditional use of force to exert international influence and power within the world. But what Nye did and what makes his scholarship unique is he says, well, yep, that still is true. And indeed, there is the exertion of hard power out there. But what he is particularly interested in is in this notion of soft power, that it's not forceful, it's not coercive, it's winning over and publics and spreading one's influence through the means of attraction and persuasion. That you may attract another group or another country through a series of persuasive or encouraging actions to try and softly influence and persuade them to do what you want. That you think about them, that they think about your country and act in a particular way through a series of persuasive elements. So Nye argues that these forms of public diplomacy are really expressions of soft power. They're trying to persuade rather than coerce other nations. And it's become increasingly more prominent, this soft power persuasion, in the ways in which international and foreign diplomats have gone about international relations. In other words, soft power resides ultimately in the ability to shape the preferences of others to align with the preferences of your own. That's what Grix and Lee argue. So it's all about influence and persuasion at the particular moment, at the contemporary moment within international politics. It's about positioning a nation as attractive and appealing and something that you would aspire into being. And it's more likely that a nation will have other nations want to follow it and agree to the ways that it's viewing the world if those elements of power are a bit more persuasive and attractive rather than forceful. So that's the key to soft power, is about persuasion rather than coercion. And we can see a few different examples here, but in many respects, soft power is a form of nation branding. It's turning the nation into a brand that has a particular identity, an identity on meaning, and it's all about creating a positive sensibility. And you can actually see that there are independent rankings that look at overall brand rankings and national brand rankings, which is almost an evaluative criteria of the success of soft power strategies and public diplomacy. So the meaning, the value, the reputation of a nation are constructed in this way. These are those subtle and attractive elements rather than coercive. Now, by sport spectacles, what we and what's interesting then, in what most of my research is interested in, is the ways in which sport and mass sport spectacles, international sport mega events, and international sporting events more generally, fit within this series of soft power accumulation and wider efforts toward public diplomacy. That mass-mediated global sporting events like the Olympic Games, the World Cup, the Super Bowl have significant impact on international politics, and specifically the position and influence of one nation within the international community and the ways that other nations might see the host nation of some of these events. And so by those sports spectacles, we're really talking about the Olympic Games and the World Cup, both the men's and increasingly the women's World Cup. So we can think about those two as being the predominant examples of the ways in which sport is often linked to wider international relations, public diplomacy, and the exertion of this new notion of soft power. And we can even think about the Super Bowl. Yes, we all probably watched the Super Bowl this past weekend. And in some ways, the Super Bowl is a soft power exercise, an expression of U.S. capitalism, commercialism, and the American cultural way of life. So hosting global sport mega events has become an important, dare I even say, crucial part of public diplomacy and soft power strategies. So we can think about how and why a nation might go to great efforts and great lengths to host one of these events, and ultimately what type of return they might get on what tends to be a massive economic, social, and environmental cost of staging these spectacles. And according to Call, the Olympic Games, and I would also throw in the World Cup, both men's and women's, are themselves an exercise in public diplomacy for essentially the sole purpose of prestige. Why this is because they're an exercise in public diplomacy. Because what you're doing by securing the hosting rights for one of these events is you're trying to further your standing within the world, the community of nations, and that's what really happens when you're able as a nation to secure one of these events. It's about prestige and status, therefore soft power and influence. In other words, it's an effective way, according to Beissel, of hosting a sport mega event is one of the most effective ways to project that soft power on a global scale. And here are just a few ways that happens. It's important that hosting an event in general isn't done. It's not just about the sport. It's about the pomp and circumstance that goes before, during, and after those events. So a prominent example that we can point to is the closing and opening ceremonies of the Olympic Games. And you can see some images here. It's all about performing and presenting officially sanctioned depictions and understandings of the host nation. It is, in many cases, a multi-billion-dollar advertisement and nation branding exercise as part of wider public diplomacy and international relations. So what I want to do now is I want to sort of choose one example, and we can point to a range of different examples. In fact, we could probably point to any singular sport mega event as a way to explore the notions of nation branding and the ways in which a nation uses its events to try and promote and persuade international communities toward a favorable light of the host nation. What I'm going to drill down to right now, and what I want to speak about, is an event that just happened a few months ago, and this was the 2022 Men's World Cup, the FIFA Men's World Cup held in Qatar. So we're going to talk about soft empowerment, or maybe even introduce the idea of soft disempowerment. So that's something that we can consider as an outcome of the ways in which these nations host such an event. So here, soft power is characterized differently, and we'll see the ways in which in Qatar, a country was trying to use the event, the World Cup, to create a trusted and admired feeling or sensibility within the international community that was meant to generate high levels of soft power to shape, change, and influence external views of the country. We can say that this idea, and we're going to define sports washing here in a moment, but sports washing and the use of sport mega events for soft power is really wrapped up into a wider geopolitical economy of sport. That's simply a way to theorize all of the connections between geography, between politics, between economic activity as they relate to sport, as they relate to production, trade, governments, international relations, that sport becomes a primary means. And the entire notion of different nations using sport to compete and nation brand against one another is in and of itself an entire economy worth examining. So the geopolitical economy of sport, it encapsulates everything from event hosting, the decisions for particular nations to host over others, and the ownership of sport assets, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Even the use of sport as an instrument of soft power, propaganda, and as a means through which countries access scarce resources within the sporting domain. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is that sport becomes, and to be honest, has long been the arena for competing ideologies to battle out for global dominance. And in the Middle East, particularly, the geopolitical economy of sport has emerged as a particularly powerful and timely means of exacting soft power persuasion and generating the accumulation of diverse forms of capital. One, economic, but also social and cultural, and I would even say political capital within the international community. And so while the geopolitical economy of sport has long been around, it has certainly rose to prominence recently within the Middle East, and we can point to a few examples. Now, that's not to say that sport is entirely new within the Middle East. In fact, for the past 5,000 years, sport has been an essential part of Middle Eastern history and society. And there are deep roots to religious ceremonies, royal courts, the births and lives of individuals, and really the entire development of the region within the 21st century have all intersected with important cultural and historical processes of which sport plays a prominent role. So on the one hand, sport is not something new to the Middle East, but in fact has a long and distinct history. Yet sporting activities have been profoundly influenced recently by these processes and help shape them at the same time. So as elsewhere, sport, especially football or soccer, whichever term you might want to use, has been an important agent of social integration and a major arena in which ethnic and religious differences and identities and practices have played out. This all leads us to a term that has originated quite recently, known as sports washing. Some of you may have come across this term, particularly in light of the 2022 FIFA Men's World Cup, both in the coverage of the event, also the broadcasting of it. And this term sports washing, it was first coined in 2015, but the term has emerged recently around oftentimes events held in the Middle East as really referencing the ways in which a state uses international sports to effectively not only nation brand, but clean up its public image. It's laundering states, the argument goes, that bear blemished records that harm their image and impede their overall national interests. So they invest in sport to distract or redirect attention among target audiences from their flaws. In that respect, sports washing is a form of reputation laundering, where sports serve as a tool for information manipulation and nation rebranding and soft power persuasion. It goes back to that soft power politics approach. Recently, a scholar in my field, Jules Boykoff, produced the first really academic research formally theorizing this term, and you can see his definition on the screen. Boykoff refers to sports washing as a phenomenon whereby political leaders use sport to appear important or legitimate on the world stage, while stoking nationalism and deflecting attention from chronic social problems and human rights woes on the home front. Sports watchers use mega events like the Olympic Games or the World Cup to try and foment national prestige and to convey economic or political advancement. So with this definition in mind, I want you to think a little bit critically about the ways in which sport washing not only takes place now, but sports washing may have existed for a long period of time. We might have called it propaganda or sports propaganda, but even though the term itself is new, I think the practices that sport washing is really referring to have been around for a really long time. And as Boykoff points out, sports washing can emerge in both authoritarian and democratic political spaces because it's all about social relationships that entangle multiple audiences, domestic, abroad, even sometimes regional, to try and target a country's internal and external population. We can point to several examples. First, one of the earliest and most prominent examples would be the ways in which the Olympic Games in 1936 in Berlin were used by Adolf Hitler to advance German National Socialism. We can point to the 1980 Olympic Games in Moscow and probably the 1984 Games in the United States in Los Angeles as really epitomizing the difference between Soviet communism and U.S. capitalism around the height of the Cold War. And more recently, we can point to an example in democratic political space, the ways in which the 2002 Salt Lake City Winter Games were used and mobilized by the Bush administration shortly after 9/11 at a time where they were trying to generate support for military intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan. You see the flag being the flag from 9/11 being used there. So the point here is we probably have always long had elements of this sport washing effect take place in and around sport mega events, but I would argue, probably have just a new term or a new vernacular to think about the ways in which we would define or theorize what's been long happening with the use of political leaders and international sport mega events. But of course, to be clear, the emergence of sport washing isn't only limited to the Middle East. In fact, what I think this political cartoon is referring to is the ways in which sport washing exists within other and multiple countries in the particular moment, I would argue. If we look at the previous two FIFA World Cups, so 2018 in Russia and 2022 in Qatar. It's sort of a passing of the torch, is I think ultimately what this is symbolizing. And in both instances, both nations, one might argue, have approached the hosting of the World Cup as a sports washing exercise. Specifically, we can look at Russia, the hosting of the Olympic Games in Sochi in 2014, as well as the FIFA World Cup in 2018. It shouldn't surprise us then that shortly after both events, Vladimir Putin used the goodwill accumulated by these events to further military advancements, i.e., shifting soft power into hard power into Crimea and Ukraine. So what we can think about then is more of a sports washing moment in which not only has sport washing been around for a long period of time, but the ways in which and the motivations behind hosting international mega events have become heightened within the particular political and social moment. However, as I mentioned earlier, arguably the most high-profile event of sport washing that we have to date was the one that just happened a few months ago in Qatar. It involved a soft power strategizing, and it goes all the way back to the reasons why Qatar won the rights to host the FIFA Men's World Cup in the first place. You might ask yourself, how did Qatar, a country completely ill-equipped to host international sport mega events and a Men's World Cup, how did it end up hosting the world's largest and most popular sport tournament? Well, what we now know is that after years of investigations and indictments by the U.S. State Department of Justice, it's pretty conclusive that representatives working for Qatar bribed FIFA officials to secure the hosting rights for the World Cup. U.S. prosecutors have found several details around money paid to 5 FIFA board members in advance of the vote in 2010, which would later confer the rights to host the 2022 games to Qatar. Qatar, a tiny desert state the size of Connecticut, has spent $220 billion in order to stage a 4-week international sport mega event, the 2022 World Cup. And ironically, when it came down to the 2 finalists of who would host that World Cup, it was Qatar against the United States in a runoff election. And what we now know is that election, that vote was not impartial. It was the result of bribes and kickbacks paid quite literally in suitcases full of cash to top FIFA executives. In fact, more than half of the people involved in voting for the 2018 and 2022 hosting of the World Cup have now been formally indicted for their wrongdoing and accused of bribery, kickbacks, and criminal charges. Now, the choice of Qatar, a country with such hot summers that 5 years after the FIFA vote, FIFA decided to move the World Cup from the summer months in June and July to the winter months in November. It received most of the attention after the votes, but Russia too had allegations of corruption and improper bidding behavior. Now, this small Gulf nation of Qatar has spent decades building a vast sport empire powered by sweeping investments in clubs, competitions, confederations, and events all across 6 continents. In fact, a week after securing the tournament in 2010, Doha's investment nonprofit, the Qatar Foundation, struck a $220 million deal with FC Barcelona to sponsor the Spanish club's kits. 6 months later, an arm of Qatari sovereign wealth fund, the Qatar Investment Authority, QSI, paid as much as $58 million to take over French club PSG, whose valuation today is around $3 to $4 billion. Just a couple of months after that, the state conglomerate Al Jazeera doled out $130 million for the rights to broadcast League One matches to French households. We can point to a few other examples, the Qatar Open Tennis Tournament and Formula One, as all part of a wider portfolio from the Qatari government and Qatari investment funds and royal families to invest in sport for purposes of nation branding and soft power. But of course, Qatar is not alone, and we can look at other examples within this region. Within the UAE, we have examples from Abu Dhabi. We have the ownership of Manchester City Football Club. We have documentaries which bring to light the ways in which ownership and the Abu Dhabi Investment Group have been beneficial to European football, and particularly Manchester City. We've got World Tennis Championships, F1 Grand Prix again. Again, these are all highly successful results that, in the case of Man City, have won 5 of the last 10 English Premier League titles, all under the Abu Dhabi ownership group. And finally, and more recently, we have examples from Saudi Arabia. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia joined their neighbors in turning to sport to derive soft power. Within the last year, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the investment fund invested in Newcastle Football Club, has started up the new Live Golf Series. There are a series of UFC matches, boxing matches, even rumors of Saudi Arabia buying WWE, as well as, again, a consistent theme here, another Formula One race within this region. So what's interesting to me is it's not one particular nation doing this sort of investing in sport for soft power. What you're seeing is an entire region sort of, on the one hand, unifying together with this particular strategy, but at the same time, they're also trying to outcompete one another. And the length of this talk doesn't provide for me to get into the differences and the distinctions between and politics and relations between these nations, but suffice it to say, they're not always hunky-dory, that there are complexities between the ways in which these nations relate to one another. And so this investment of sport is as much presenting a positive light to the global community as it is regionally to try and posture against what is essentially a rivalry between nation states within the Middle East. But suffice it to say, sport investments are attractive to states because they come with a payoff. Some of these, arguably the more important, are financial. Indeed, journalists and advocates who gloss over the economics of sport miss a key motivation behind state participation. Clearly, Qatar is not going to get back a $220 billion economic return on investment. There must be something greater here. The football economy on a whole has become quite volatile because of these investments, and it's really shifted the power hierarchy away from Western Europe toward the Middle East as a result of this massive economic investment. And alongside these financial payoffs, some of which are profound, the return on investment for a particular club, some additional kit sales, or some revenue generated from Formula One, what we're really talking about is something far less quantifiable. And these are those reputational benefits that come along with this sports washing effect. So sports washing is more than a confluence of athletics and economics. It's really for aspiring launderers. It's about the bankability of sports to, in some cases, discredit, displace, or devalue potentially damaging ideas or content reaching global audiences. And so ever since Qatar won the rights to host the 2022 World Cup, Qatar has been the subject of sustained critical scrutiny. A spotlight has been shown on the Gulf Emirates' repression of women, LGBTQ rights, human rights abuses, and a series of other issues affecting migrant workers. And so the 2022 FIFA Men's World Cup could well be viewed, at least partly, as an exercise for maintaining, this should say, Qatar's well-established soft power influence within international relations. It's a vehicle for soft power branding of Qatar, a rebranding of the nation against negative associations. That happens in 2, maybe even 3 ways. One, internally, for the particular party in charge to reinforce its position of leadership and reinforce support for its particular ideologies, but also externally as well to the entire global community. The third one I'd probably put in here is within that intra-regional rivalry between other states within that Gulf region. And here we have an example on this in the photo on the bottom right is the Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia joining the Qatari Emir during a match in the World Cup. This was highly controversial. Those 2 nations have not seen eye to eye. There have been multiple frictions politically and economically as well in the sporting realm around media rights and streaming and piracy. And so this was seen regionally, the World Cup, as an opportunity for maybe a thawing of particularly hostile relations between two adversarial regimes. This is how it is thought of being significant for the nation, the soft power rationale and justifications for being and bidding on the World Cup. First, identifying, in this case, Qatar as a modern, innovative, and technologically advanced society, putting Qatar on the map, in other words. And two, projecting an image and peace, an image of peace, security, and integrity, distancing in some ways Qatar from the Middle East. So it's both doing two things at the same time, putting Qatar on the map and maybe distancing Qatar from perceptions of what the Middle East might be, and perceptions, particularly over the last 2 decades of Western intervention within the Middle East, of images and ideas of what those societies might look like. So this probably leads to two outcomes. What we're saying is, yes, there are positive outcomes. There is soft empowerment. But what I want to think about, and what I challenge you all to think about, and what I would encourage my students to think about if this were in the classroom, are the ways in which sport washing also creates negative outcomes and in some ways leads to a process of disempowerment. So I want to unpack these two over the next 5 minutes before we start to wrap everything up. So on the one hand, we have what we would call soft empowerment. This was the first edition of the FIFA Men's World Cup to be held in the Middle East. A hugely symbolic event, a welcome development within the entire history of soccer or football. It really, the entire history has tilted the power center of football to Europe, and this event shifted that power focus from Europe and Western democracies from controlling essentially the game toward perhaps what we might call the global South, or regions which have been historically underserved, underprivileged, colonialized, or suffered imperialism over time. So it was the first time all 5 African sides competing within the World Cup at least won a game. The fans of many African countries, Ghana, Senegal, Cameroon, along with many of their counterparts within Argentina and Wales, they were almost stars in their own right, filling stadiums. And Doha's new metro system was a marvelous color and tapestry of noise and flags and celebration from a new region of soccer fans, which had in many ways been historically excluded from part of this global and international football community. Football, in other words, doesn't only belong to the West. And what we think is that maybe there was an element of soft empowerment here, a way in which that this sort of shifted that existing power hierarchy of who controls the global game away from a historically British and European sport toward the global South. Now, any discussion about Qatar as a nation state needs to really start at the point where we acknowledge how Qatar even came to be. Qatar is the product of British imperialism, which first integrated the Gulf states, Kuwait, Bahrain, UAE, into structures of the global economy. In other words, Qatar that we know today exists as a byproduct of Western imperialism, colonialism, and in some cases, exploitation. In other words, it was the West that put in charge autocracies and royal families within the Middle East to protect their economic investments, oftentimes fueled by a quite conservative culture and cultural dynamic. The tournament, for many, has already been heralded as a success. And here are a few quotes. You can read these in terms of the outcome of the event. You can see that Andreas Krieg, an associate professor within my field, that Qatar became a rallying point, a point of pride for the entire Arab and Islamic world. That the event put Qatar and, dare I say, the entire Middle East on the map, certainly within the context of football and potentially wider within international community. And here we have Gianni Infantino, the president of FIFA, suggesting that despite some of the issues that Qatar faced and the ones that we're going to discuss here in a moment, that as President Infantino argues, the World Cup shined a light not only the positive aspects of some of these countries, but maybe some of the negative ones, the region, as in particular Qatar more specifically, and to try and bring about some sort of transformative change. So in this viewpoint, perhaps there was some success. Perhaps the Qatari government benefited by its $220 billion investment to create those soft power and elements and soft empowerment. But we could also say that soft power is complicated. And we can't just say that because you use these strategies, because you host an international sport mega event, that it's necessarily going to work. Because public diplomacy sometimes goes the opposite direction. There's no guarantee, as Qatar 2022 shows us, that these soft power benefits will in fact happen. Sometimes what happens is the increased scrutiny and attention from the world from hosting these events leads to quite the opposite. It exacerbates problems and it doesn't alleviate image problems. It actually contributes to them. In other words, hosting these mega events, it could be argued, makes the perception, the reputation, the nation branding a bit worse because people are now firmly focused on what's going on in a particular host country, in this case, Qatar, where some of those issues or problems are now brought to light and the world becomes aware of them. To that point, we can look at Beijing 2008, Sochi 2014 as examples of the ways in which that there is no guarantee that sport is going to be a successful soft power strategy, that there's not necessarily going to be this attractive or influential outcome that creates favorable views within the global community of nations. So what I'm suggesting is that maybe what's also happening at the same time is an element of soft disempowerment, a strategy or scrutiny leading to offending, alienating, or really the rejection of other nations, rendering a nation less attractive and less influential within the sphere of global politics. And because of this, these strategies, and because these strategies or this scrutiny can render a nation less attractive, maybe in the end, this is a poor, not only economic investment, but a poor cultural and social and political one as well. And we can point to a series of examples within Qatar that point this out. Various things have happened that have compromised Qatar's nation branding strategy. First, we have the corruption in the bid process, which creates this idea that things in Qatar happen in a non-transparent way. And so if the entire point is to signify that Qatar is open for business for Western corporations, companies, and international publics, maybe what this is demonstrating is that it's not the same approach, it's not the same transparency that one might expect with doing business within Western democracies. Second, we have the issues of sexual minority discriminations. We have also examples similar to Putin's Russia, particularly around the LGBTQ plus community, as well as the stance of Qatari culture and society where homosexual behavior is illegal. We also have examples of alcohol consumption. Some of you may be aware that shortly before the event, the Qatari government came in and also said that consuming beer would be against local custom and law, and therefore that was prohibited as well. And so these types of issues, these cultural issues, then emerge in the fore and highlight some of the discriminatory or culturally conservative aspects within a particular host nation. We also have examples of environmental degradation and the inhospitable climate that was simply expecting to host these events within a ridiculously hot summer and necessitated building stadiums that were air conditioned, that cost hundreds of millions and billions of dollars. That would be what we would call in our field sporting white elephants, in that they have very little use after the events have concluded. So in the case of Qatar 2022, there were 8 brand new stadiums built, 7 of which had air conditioning. And you can see and you can think through the entire environmental effect of this type of investment. Perhaps most prominently are the negative effects, perhaps most importantly around the negative effects of Qatar are the human rights abuses of workers. many of whom are migrant workers, part of the kafala system. Within this, it's becoming, and it became a very big issue. As I point out in the next slide, there were over 4,000 deaths associated with building the stadium infrastructure and facilities to support the 2022 World Cup. And this system grants the government and construction syndicates, often intertwined, the means to have total control over workers and labor, leading in many cases to exploitation, abuse, where the workers have no redress. They can't complain about those conditions, and in some cases, they cannot leave because their passports are held by the companies and the contractors that imported them as migrant workers. So you can see there are significant human rights issues that came with the hosting of this event. So it's estimated that it was estimated, and it was even later acknowledged by authorities in Qatar, that around 4,000 workers lost their life, which ironically is more people than actually stepped foot on the pitch during the FIFA Men's World Cup. So there's a huge global negative perception of Qatar because of these exploitative, abusive, and highly dangerous working conditions faced by often migrant workers to simply deliver the facilities and venues necessary to stage the event. And finally, we have the economic extravagance. I've mentioned the price tag of the event, $220 billion. We can see how that compares to the hosting of previous Men's World Cups, more than 10 times the cost of the highest World Cup to date. Here are just some examples of the stadiums and facilities. We're not just talking about stadiums. Again, of the 8 stadiums used, 7 of them were built completely from scratch. The cooling systems that were put in place were drastically caused the construction costs to drastically increase. The systems were installed to keep players, fans, and everybody at an appropriate temperature for the events. But it's also the additional amenities. It's the hotels, it's the private islands, all of which were built from scratch, effectively from the sands in the desert, to deliver the event. So what I'm thinking about then is that Qatar 2022 is arguably an example of sport disempowerment. And as it says here, these things need to be addressed swiftly if Qatar is to maintain its international credibility, if ultimately the use of this event is to try and create favorable international relations. Because a modern nation state is supposed to be fully integrated, it's supposed to have high-tech innovations, it's supposed to be open to everyone. A modern society cannot have this lack of human rights for its migrant workers, its dangerous working conditions, its negative and deleterious effects to the environment. And because of all these factors, there is quite an anti-Qatar viewpoint on the nation, and maybe it could be argued that Qatar's image may well have failed in the end. Thus, as we've seen here, soft power and soft powers and the leveraging of sport to exert soft power and to accumulate soft power, it can never be guaranteed. What I think Qatar 2022 demonstrates is that there are very many things that can go into play in negotiating potential rebranding strategies within a nation. So to then draw this all to a conclusion, what does this all mean? So what does this all mean? It means that sports spectacles play a potentially significant role in international relations. Qatar 2022 offers us a glimpse into the purpose and intention of using sport mega events as a soft power strategy toward image laundering and nation building. More recently, this notion has been labeled sports washing. Certainly, Qatar would not have spent $220 billion if it didn't think there was some sort of return on their investment, be it economic, social, cultural, and/or political. But as we've seen, the added attention brings additional levels of scrutiny, which might be as opposed as much as they are supported. So there's no necessary outcome that a host nation will be viewed as more attractive and therefore potentially influential. So this leads me to the ultimate question. Does sports washing work? You know, in the lead up and during and after the events, I was interviewed several times by different media outlets based on my research. And I was asked this question quite a bit. And I'm not sure I have a particularly good answer because for me, I think it's a little bit of both. And this is what I want you all as the audience, as the viewers of this presentation to think through. Does sports washing work? Because clearly, I would point out that much of Qatar's success was based off of what happened on the field. Football has dominated the discourse since the event kicked off, and in some cases is how the event is going to be remembered. It was the first legitimate run by an Arab nation as Morocco made the semifinal. We can think about Mbappe's performance in the final, a final for the ages between Argentina and France that was settled on PKs, or the dramatic ending that saw Messi finally win his long-coveted World Cup. In terms of viewership, all of these criticisms are right and justified, and yet, did it matter? Not at all if we're looking at television viewership. Despite widespread condemnation in the weeks preceding the tournament and the years leading up to the tournament, the viewing figures were not affected at all. In fact, it was the most viewed Men's World Cup in history. In fact, the match on November 21st between the US and England broke ratings on American sport TV. So if you're thinking, well, maybe in the US, there was a lot of pushback and people not tuning in because of these sport washing effects, the ratings would say otherwise. And we can look at how the viewership compares to the Super Bowl in that it's over 10 times larger. And I'll conclude with this. This is a quote from John Oliver. He has many times taken FIFA to task over its running and hosting of sport mega events, its corruption, and run several segments on his show last week tonight, dismantling the organization over the past decade. But he sums up his feelings quite nicely here. As Oliver says, by this point, I hope I've proven to you that FIFA is just appalling. And yet, here's their power. I'm still so excited for the World Cup. It's very hard to justify how I get so much joy from an organization that has caused so much pain. In other words, despite all of this, we're still going to watch. So the $1 million question is, what would it take? What would it take for all of us to push back, to finally address these sport washing effects head on and enact some form of meaningful social and cultural and political change to bring about a more socially just, inclusive society that I think most of us aspire to have. So that's it for my formal presentation, but I do have 2 discussion questions. I'm happy now to turn it over to Molly for our last 10 minutes to field questions, or we can tackle any of these. I'm curious to hear what you think. Based on everything I've said over the past 45 minutes, 1, do you think sport washing works? Or 2, do you think Qatar's leveraging of sport for soft power purposes led to more soft power empowerment or disempowerment? And typically, this is the point where I turn it over to the students and we break into small groups and I facilitate a discussion for 20 to 25 minutes. So that's it for my formal presentation. I'm curious to hear what you think, what questions you have, and I'll turn it over to Molly to facilitate that Q&A.
Adam, this is fascinating stuff. This is a whole new way to look at sports in general, specifically like these giant sort of international inspired events. And I'm not by nature a football watcher. American football, sure.
Yeah.
Soccer, not really ever been my thing, but I was certainly in tune with sort of the negativity in the ether surrounding the World Cup in Qatar. So I would be curious, and I love the discussion questions that you provided. Let's give our viewers some time to submit some. I've got a couple other questions for you in the meantime. But I'm curious, like there seems to be some like high level benefits to sports washing to some degree that seem to really benefit sort of like, you know, the big cheeses at the top. But can you speak to sort of, are there any benefits to like the smaller local economy, or what are the consequences when all of the sports stuff sort of packs up and goes home and now you're left with this big expensive infrastructure you don't have a purpose for?
Yeah, a great example of that latter point is Brazil, which spent before Qatar, the previous high was about $20 billion. They built several stadiums in the Amazon rainforest, which to date are now most effectively used as bus depots. There are no teams to host them. So in many cases, the upkeep and the maintenance costs of these facilities are so high that it's more cost effective to just simply let the stadiums fall into a state of disrepair. And so we're probably going to see a series of these happen within Qatar, although I do think it might not be as profound as some of the other nations, because in some ways the World Cup was really just the starting point of a series of kind of shifting and wrestling control of football away from Western Europe toward the Middle East. And so I see a Women's World Cup coming to Saudi Arabia or Qatar, or maybe even a joint bid between those two nations, which have a really fascinating and fractious relationship over time. And so I think, whereas maybe Brazil was a one-off, I think this is just the starting point. And hopefully, on the one hand, it's not going to lead to 4,000 senseless deaths for a 4-week celebration of football, that it'll actually have the stadiums and facilities will have longer use after the event has concluded.
Yeah, those consequences are like really hard to justify when you start putting the numbers to it. So that's certainly food for thought, I think, as we sort of move toward new fingerprints on the sport and sort of who gets to play within. Let's see, we've got a couple other ones that came in. Let me get to them. Let's see. Do you believe that the LIV golf tour, I think is it LIV or Live Golf Tour, do you think it intends to be a profitable endeavor, or do you think that this is just another sort of sports washing expense with a purpose?
That's a really good question. The history of upstart sport leagues, whether it's the NFL or Major League Baseball, the WNBA, it takes a really long time for leagues to be profitable. The NBA existed for 50 years before they even got games on live television. So I'd say in the short term, it's going to be a money-losing proposition. But what they're trying to do is really unsettle that kind of Western dominant hierarchy of golf being particularly controlled by, in this case, the PGA. And so if you look at the recent broadcast deal that they signed, Live Golf is actually paying the broadcast network to put the games on television to at least get some exposure, rather than generating millions of dollars from selling those broadcast rights. But that's probably not atypical, because upstart sport leagues take a really long period of time to generate those type of eyeballs. But I would say there's so much money behind Live Golf that it could shorten that period of time, where it could eventually turn into being profitable. But I think, as the person asking the question points out, is profit really even the goal here, right? Is it about something else?
I got you. That makes really good sense when you spin it that way. That actually really checks out in my brain. Thank you for that. This question is from Jeff. He says, if there's a potentially high disempowerment risk for countries to host events like the Olympics or the World Cup, in addition to sort of the waste of resources, to build infrastructure for the short term, why doesn't FIFA or the Olympic Committee use sort of a short list of host cities or places to cycle through to sort of eliminate some of this unnecessary politicking and ethics crises?
That's a fantastic question. I could speak about it briefly on the Olympic side. There's certainly a movement to have one city or nation be the kind of like home base of the Olympics. There have been some suggestions that maybe Greece could do that. I don't know if that'll ever happen. But what you have seen is that there's been essentially a tipping point. After 2010 happened within FIFA, FIFA completely attempted to change its organization. They enacted a series of governance reforms. There's an entirely new bidding process. Instead of a select group of executive committee members that get to decide, it's now one vote per country. So instead of 24 people, it's now 200 different soccer associations. So they're trying to bring about more clarity, transparency, ethics to the entire process, to mixed results. A lot of my research is focused on 2026, and we can talk about 2026. The next event will be joint hosted by the US, Mexico, and Canada. And the reason, I would argue, one of the main reasons that bid won was in reference to everything that had previously happened in Qatar and Russia. There's already existing stadia. There's already existing infrastructure. It is and was as risk averse a bid as FIFA could ever dream of. And oh, by the way, FIFA lost billions of dollars of sponsorships as a result of its corruption crisis. And there's no place better in the world to put a World Cup to generate a type of return than the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And so there's a lot of things going on. And what I'm trying to think about is the fundamental question of like, how and in what ways is sports washing taking place within the 2026 World Cup? Like, sports washing doesn't only just happen within the Middle East, despite that's oftentimes when we use that term. I mean, we have our own human rights issues within our own country. We have issues of LGBTQ discrimination, women's rights issues. So when U.S. soccer puts a U.S. women's friendly in Florida, given recent events there, is that sports washing? Because if that was happening in other countries, we would say it is. So I don't know that it is. I think it's super complicated, but what I'm trying to get my students to think about and what I'm trying to wrestle with are the ways in which those processes are similar and different, played out in different countries and jurisdictions around the world. I hope that makes sense.
It does make sense. Yeah. It certainly illustrates sort of what a sticky ball of wax this business is.
Yep.
So sort of related to that, and we're getting close on time. But accountability, you touched a little on it, but who's bringing accountability to the fine folks at FIFA who sort of turn a blind eye to any number of infractions and sins they're committing against, the people who are hosting them and they're wheeling and dealing with?
That's a great question. And I think that's what I sort of tried to allude to in the conclusion is that, there have been reforms within FIFA. There's a much more transparent process, but there are still politics at work. There's still allegations of bribery and corruption, whether it's covert or in some cases overt. But I think for me, what I'm trying to think about is ultimately it would have to be us, right? Unless we stop watching, there's very little incentive for FIFA or its corporate sponsors to change the way they go about business. And John Oliver, I pointed out, you can find those clips. They're hysterical because he goes for 20 minutes about how awful all this stuff is. And he's like, you know what? I'm still going to watch. Right. And I was still watching. And the irony is this, and I'll probably, think about how this is probably a great example of how I'm trying to wrestle with this. You can probably see here, I got a series of, I'm a Liverpool soccer fan. I've got all their scarves up on my wall. I got a bunch of jerseys up here in my office. Their club is for sale. They are currently owned by the owner of the Boston Red Sox, who is a very shrewd investment banker. He's looking to not put a lot of money in, but get return on his investment. And there are rumors that the Qatari Sport Investment Group wants to buy my beloved football club. And how do I feel about that? How do I feel about the reality that there will be probably billions of dollars pumped into signing the best players, building the best facilities, probably for the purpose of nation branding, but it's going to mean that every Saturday or Sunday, my team's going to win more. And I don't know how to wrestle with that, right? This is the complicated nature of being a fan. And whether your favorite NFL team signs a quarterback who's accused of sexual assault, or your team might be bought by, a government which has a dubious human rights record, I think this is the conflicted nature that the sports world gives to us fans. And unless we stop watching, there's very little incentive to change that behavior. And I think I, as well as many other people, are part of that problem.
Well, I hate to say exactly, because I too am part of the problem. I think maybe half the battle is us recognizing that. I know many of us probably have similar relationships with the NFL. So I think, our very relationship with sports sort of maybe got us here in the first place. We're really all in with our teams and our sports figures. So sort of parsing out our priorities here is going to be important moving forward. So thank you for being here and for putting this spin on on this ball here, if you will. I think this is just really interesting stuff, and the next time we tune into anything, I think that's team sport related and sort of strategic marketing for any number of things. This is really good fodder to think about. So we really appreciate you being here,
No
Adam. You're
problem. Happy to be here. I
always
go
a joy.
through, I talk pretty fast. I go through a lot of slides, but that's just my style. The thing that I would point people to is there's a Women's World Cup this summer in Australia and New Zealand. It's going to be the biggest, most commercially viable event. Lots of different discussions around gender, maybe even, dare I say, gender washing, with the ways in which FIFA is looking to sort of build its brand around inclusivity and gender. So there will be similar questions asked with that event, as well as 2026, which is hosted here in the US, Mexico, and Canada. So put that on your radar, everyone, to start asking these critical questions and think reflexively about how we as sport fans engage with these events.
Gender washing, part 2 of our webinars with Adam Beissel.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you so much for being
Sure.
here. You are always super informative, and you really add a whole new layer of something to think about when we watch our sport. So
Cool.
Many thanks to you for being here, Adam. We always enjoy you. Thank you again to all of those of you who watched. If you want to share this presentation or rewatch, a recording will be available later today with other recordings from our Winter College collection. We hope you'll consider joining us for the remaining of our Winter College events, all of which can be found on our webinar site, alumlc.org/MiamiOH. Love and honor to you all. Adam, thank you again.
Thanks.
Glad to
Bye,
have
everyone.
you.